A cowboy saves an Apache girl in pain from broken ribs, then danger strikes. The prairie wind carried a sharp bite that morning when Nathaniel Carter found her. She lay crumpled near the edge of a dry arroyo, her breathing shallow, her arm curled protectively over her ribs. A woman alone in the wilderness was unusual enough, but one this battered, it spoke of a story too cruel to tell. Nathaniel slid from his horse, boots crunching against the sand, and knelt beside her. Her dark hair was matted with dust, her lips split from thirst, yet her eyes, wide, fearful, followed every movement of his hand. She flinched when he reached for her, as though touch itself had become another wound. "Easy now," he murmured, voice low, steady like water over stone. "You're safe. No harm will come from me." Her breath rattled in response. Pain knifed through her chest, and he knew enough from trail injuries to recognize broken ribs. Whoever had done this hadn't cared if she lived to see another sunrise. With careful strength, he lifted her, feeling the tremor of her body against his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a sparrow bruised by the storm. His horse shifted, sensing urgency, and Nathaniel mounted with her in his hold, pressing his jaw tight against the surge of anger. Somewhere and out there, a man still walked free who thought he owned her life. Back at his ranch, the long hours blurred. He boiled water, tore strips of cloth, steadied her cries as he wrapped her ribs tight enough to hold but not crush. She barely spoke, only fragments between gasps. "Judge, papers, can't go back. Judge." The word struck him like a cold hammer. Lawmen in these territories carried power heavier than any six-shooter, and some used it darker than bandits ever dreamed. When at last she slept, Nathaniel sat near the window, lantern light flickering against his weathered face. He stared out at the wide stretch of prairie where the horizon met the stars. He'd buried a wife on this land, thought he'd buried his heart too. Yet here was another soul, bruised but unbroken, delivered to his doorstep by what some might call chance, and others might call providence. But chance or providence, danger had only begun. For men like Judge Harrington did not let go. And if this woman, this Eliza, was brave enough to defy him, then the storm following her would soon roll across Nathaniel's quiet valley. And Nathaniel Carter, whether he willed it or not, had just stepped into its path. The next morning, light poured across the Dakota plains in pale ribbons, and with it came the restless sounds of a house no longer empty. Nathaniel had grown used to silence these past years, the scrape of his own chair at the table, the hollow creak of floorboards under only one set of boots. Now there was the faint stir of a woman breathing in the spare room, the cautious shifting of blankets, as if even rest was something foreign. He set coffee to boil, the rich aroma filling the cabin. When Eliza finally stepped into the kitchen, one hand braced against her bandaged side, she did not meet his eyes. She hovered near the door, like a wild bird not yet certain the open sky was safe. "Sit," Nathaniel said gently, pulling out a chair. His voice carried no command, only the quiet patience of a man who had long learned the futility of rushing fragile things. She lowered herself slowly, wincing, her gaze flicking toward the window where prairie grass swayed in the wind. For a time they ate in silence, his bread rough but warm, her sips of coffee small, measured. At length her voice broke the hush. "I shouldn't have come." "You didn't come," he answered, meeting her guarded glance. "The prairie brought you here. Maybe God did." Her brow furrowed at the word, God. She had prayed once, in the long nights under Harrington's roof, when the weight of his authority smothered her voice. Prayers whispered into pillows, prayers swallowed in fear. For years it had seemed heaven kept its doors barred. Yet she was still alive. She had made it here, and this stranger, this cowboy, had not turned her away. Nathaniel did not press. He merely leaned back, eyes drifting to the cross he'd carved years ago that still hung near the door. Its edges were worn from his hand resting there, more out of habit than ritual. Yet this morning, with Eliza sitting at his table, he wondered if the Lord had carved something new for him after all. As days stretched on, she moved with cautious steps around the ranch. He watched her pause by the fence line, fingers brushing tall grasses, as if to remind herself the world was real. She found a patch of hard earth near the house and knelt, planting seeds from a small pouch she had clutched even in her flight. "Prairie roses," she whispered, "flowers that bloomed even in poor soil." Nathaniel saw more than a woman gardening. He saw defiance wrapped in fragility, an act of quiet faith that life could still take root, even after storms. But he also knew storms did not vanish simply because one dared plant roses. Harrington's reach was long, his grip on law and power tighter than iron. And though the cabin seemed for the moment to cradle a fragile peace, Nathaniel felt it deep in his bones. Peace on the frontier was always a borrowed gift. Sooner or later, the debt came due. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The prairie days settled into a rhythm that neither of them had expected. Nathaniel Carter rose before dawn, as he always had, to see to the stock and mend the fences that seemed forever sagging. Yet now, when he returned to the cabin, there was a faint sound of movement within. Soft footsteps, a drawer closing, the delicate rattle of cups being set on the table. Eliza Moore did not fill the house with chatter. She filled it with presence. She moved carefully, still guarding her ribs, but with a determined grace that suggested she would not be broken twice. At first, she ate only what he placed before her, saying little. But slowly, a word here, a glance there, a question about the cattle or the distance to the nearest town. These were her offerings, and Nathaniel accepted them with the patience of a man who knew fragile things could not be forced. One afternoon, he found her kneeling in the patch of hard earth near the porch, fingers pressing seeds into the soil. Her breath still came shallow, but her hands were steady. "What are you planting?" he asked, leaning on the post. "Prairie roses," she said without looking up. "They bloom where most flowers won't. Stubborn things." He nodded, though in truth he had never given much thought to flowers. But the way her hands lingered in the soil, as if coaxing life itself to believe in her, made him see the act differently. This was not gardening, it was defiance. Later, inside, Nathaniel set to carving. He had always kept his hands busy in the quiet hours, but that evening the block of pine took the shape of a small cross. The work was simple, the lines unrefined, yet the act steadied him. When he set it on the shelf above the hearth, he noticed her eyes pause upon it. She said nothing, but the faintest curve touched her lips. Neither smile nor frown, but something in between, like the shadow of memory. That night, as the wind rattled the shutters, Eliza spoke in fragments. He said I belonged to him, that my voice didn't matter." She stopped, breath catching, then turned away from the lamplight. Nathaniel did not press for more. He simply stirred the fire, the flames rising with a quiet crackle, and answered, "You matter here." It was only 4 words, but they hung in the air like a vow. The following days carried small signs of change. Eliza began to hum while sweeping, low tunes that reminded him of church hymns sung in another lifetime. Nathaniel, in turn, found himself listening for that sound, as though it stitched the silence into something softer. He noticed how she glanced toward the horizon at dusk, eyes lingering on the line where earth met sky. He wondered if she was waiting for freedom or fearing pursuit, or both. And though Nathaniel spoke little of his own grief, she noticed things too. The way his hand lingered on the empty chair at the table, the care with which he touched the cross above the hearth before bed. Neither mentioned the past directly, yet each recognized the other's wounds as if they were written plainly across the walls of the cabin. By the week's end, Nathaniel realized the ranch no longer felt hollow. The same wind whistled through the cottonwoods, the same coyotes howled at night, but the air within his home had shifted. He could not name it yet, only sense it in the quiet comfort of two battered souls who, without agreement or announcement, had begun to believe in tomorrow. Still, Nathaniel knew the prairie did not grant peace freely. It loaned it, and one day the debt would be called. It was only a matter of time before word spread. The town of Mill Creek was small enough that nothing remained hidden for long, especially not the arrival of a woman at the Carter Ranch. By the second Saturday, Nathaniel hitched his wagon to take Eliza into town for supplies. He had expected stares. What he had not expected was the weight of silence that greeted them as they stepped into the mercantile. Eyes followed them, curious, cautious, some sharp with judgment. Eliza kept her gaze low, the brim of her bonnet shading her face. Still, whispers carried in the narrow aisles. "She came from Harrington's house, I heard." "No wonder she's hiding. A woman leaves a judge, there's got to be scandal." "Or courage," another voice murmured, quieter, almost reverent. Nathaniel caught that last voice and held on to it, even as the louder tones pressed like thorns. He knew what the town thought of Harrington: wealthy, educated, a man of standing. Few cared to look beneath the polished veneer. But in the hard set of Eliza's jaw, he saw her resist shrinking under their gaze. She stood straight, paid for flour and lamp oil with steady hands, then walked out without a word. That Sunday, the church bells rang clear across the valley. Nathaniel hadn't been inside in years, not since Mary's funeral. Yet Eliza asked quietly if they might attend. So they went, entering late, finding a bench near the back. The sanctuary smelled of pine and beeswax, hymnals worn at the edges. The minister, Reverend Clark, stood tall at the pulpit, his gray hair catching the light from the stained-glass window. His sermon that morning was not about judgment, but about endurance. "The Lord does not abandon the weary," he said, his voice steady. "He gathers the broken, the wounded, and those cast aside, and He restores them, not in an instant, but in His time and by His hand." Nathaniel's eyes flicked to Eliza. She sat still, her hands clasped tight in her lap, but her lips moved with the hymn the congregation began to sing, softly, hesitantly, as if remembering an old friend she had thought lost. After the service, some came forward to greet them. Mrs. Henderson, who had buried 2 children to fever, pressed Eliza's hand and whispered, "It takes strength to stand where you do." Others only nodded stiffly, their eyes unreadable. A few turned away altogether. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Eliza finally spoke when the cabin came into sight. "They see me as trouble, a shadow that will fall on anyone who dares to be near me." Nathaniel kept his gaze on the horizon. "They see you as a woman who survived." "That's more than some can understand." She didn't answer, but later that evening he heard her humming again, this time the very hymn they had sung in church. It wove through the cabin like a prayer not yet spoken aloud. Nathaniel leaned against the doorway, listening. He had not planned on faith finding its way back into his life. Yet with every note she carried, he began to wonder if Providence had not only led Eliza here, but was now leading him as well. The prairie gave no guarantees, but for the first time in years, Nathaniel felt something stir inside him, something dangerously close to hope. The peace of Mill Creek did not last long. Word of Eliza's presence had traveled faster than Nathaniel imagined, and by the 3rd week, the storm itself rode into town. Judge William Harrington arrived not on horseback like most men, but in a polished carriage that seemed out of place on the dusty street.
2 deputies rode beside him, their rifles slung but hands never far from the stocks. Behind them trailed a bespectacled man in a black coat, the kind of physician who earned more coin from politics than patients. Nathaniel saw them first when he came to trade for feed.
He knew instantly why they were here. Harrington stepped down from his carriage with the practiced grace of authority. His silver watch chain glinted in the sun, his boots unsoiled by dust. He cut through the murmuring crowd like a man accustomed to owning the space around him. When his eyes landed on Nathaniel, they narrowed, a predator measuring its prey. "Mr. Cotter," Harrington said, his voice smooth as polished stone, "I believe you've been harboring my wife." The word wife hung heavy. Eliza stiffened beside Nathaniel, her face pale but her chin lifted. "She's no one's property," Nathaniel answered. Harrington's smile did not reach his eyes. From his coat he produced a folded document, sealed with a judge's stamp. "On the contrary, this writ declares Mrs. Harrington unfit, a danger to herself, mentally unstable. By law, she returns with me for her own protection." The crowd stirred. Some nodded, cowed by the presence of legal authority. Others frowned, uneasy. Eliza's breath caught, and Nathaniel felt her grip tighten on his sleeve. The physician stepped forward, spectacles glinting. "I have examined her in the past," he lied with practiced ease. "She suffers from delusions, hysteria, common in women, I'm afraid. The judge has acted only from concern." Murmurs rippled sharper this time. Everyone in town had heard such words used before, against wives who spoke too boldly, against daughters who resisted arranged marriages. It was the language of control dressed in the robes of law. Nathaniel's jaw clenched. He met Harrington's gaze. "You forged this. Everyone here knows she's no danger, except to your pride." Harrington stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Nathaniel and Eliza heard. "You have 3 days. Return her quietly, or I'll bring more than papers. You can't stand against the law, Carter, not even with your pistol." With a snap of his fingers, Harrington signaled his men. The deputies followed, though not without hesitation, their eyes darting to Eliza as if weighing their own doubts. The carriage rolled away, leaving a trail of dust that seemed to choke the air long after it had gone. For a moment, the street was silent. Then Mrs. Henderson, the same woman who had spoken kindly in church, stepped forward and touched Eliza's arm. "Don't let him break you again," she whispered, just loud enough for others to hear. It was a small act, but Nathaniel caught the flicker it sparked in Eliza's eyes. Fear had not left her, but something else now rose beside it: resolve. As they rode back to the ranch, Nathaniel felt the pressure of Harrington's words like a ticking clock. 3 days. That was the time he had been given before the storm returned, heavier and darker. And this time it would not ride away so easily. The 3rd day arrived with a sky heavy as iron. Nathaniel had not slept, his ears tuned to every creak of the house, every howl of coyotes in the distance. He knew Harrington would come. Men like him thrived on keeping their word when it meant intimidation. By mid-afternoon, dust rose on the horizon. The carriage again, flanked by armed riders. This time, the deputies were joined by 2 hired guns, strangers with the hollow eyes of men who sold loyalty by the day. Nathaniel stood in the yard, rifle slung across his chest, boots planted firm in the dirt. Eliza came to the doorway, pale but steady. Harrington descended as though stepping into his own parlor. "Enough pretense," he called, voice carrying across the yard. "She returns with me now." "Stand aside, Carter." Nathaniel shook his head once. "She stays." The judge's smile was thin, cruel. With a flick of his hand, one deputy cocked his revolver. The sharp click shattered the stillness. Horses snorted, leather creaked, the air thick with powder yet to be fired. Then Eliza moved. She stepped forward, hand pressed against her ribs, but her voice rang clear. "You killed Adam Walker." The words cut sharper than any bullet. The men around Harrington froze. Even Nathaniel's breath caught. Eliza's eyes locked on the judge. 2 summers passed. The drought. He claimed rights to the river. You sent your men at night. He never came home. Whispers rippled among the onlookers who had trailed behind the riders, townsfolk drawn by rumor of a confrontation. Faces turned toward Harrington, searching his expression. The judge's smile faltered, then hardened. "Delusions," he snapped. "More proof of her unfit mind. Adam Walker drowned. Everyone knows it." But the deputies did not lift their guns again. One shifted uneasily in the saddle, eyes flicking to Nathaniel, then back to Eliza. Nathaniel raised his rifle slightly, not aimed, but ready. "She's not delusional."
You covered your tracks, but truth has a way of crawling to the surface. Harrington's voice rose, brittle with fury. "Stand down, all of you. She is my wife, my responsibility. The law isn't ownership," Nathaniel cut in. The silence that followed pressed down like a weight. A standoff in the open yard, the kind that could explode with a twitch of a finger. Nathaniel's heart hammered, but his eyes never left Harrington's. Then, slowly, one of the deputies lowered his revolver. The hired guns hesitated, uncertain without clear orders. The judge's power, so absolute in the courtroom, faltered under the wide sky and the steady gaze of those who had begun to doubt. "You'll regret this," Harrington hissed, fury twisting his face. He yanked the reins of his carriage, jerking his horses around. Dust rose as he retreated down the trail, the hired men trailing behind with uneasy glances. Only when the sound of wheels faded did Nathaniel exhale. He turned to Eliza. Her shoulders trembled, but her eyes were fierce, burning with the fire of someone who had finally spoken truth aloud. For the first time, she had not merely survived Harrington. She had defied him.
Nathaniel lowered his rifle, the weight of the moment settling deep in his bones. He knew Harrington would return, darker and more dangerous than before. But as he looked at Eliza, standing tall against the fading sun, he also knew they were no longer just defending a ranch. They were defending truth itself. The ranch stood quiet after the confrontation, but the silence was different now. It no longer carried fear alone. It carried the weight of something spoken that could not be unsaid. Eliza's accusation had cut through Harrington's armor, and though he had ridden away, the echo of her words lingered across Mill Creek. In town, whispers shifted. Where once the talk had been scandal and suspicion, now it was doubt. Doubt in Harrington, doubt in the stories he had spun. At the bakery, Mrs. Henderson told another woman. She stood before him, said the truth clear as day. I saw it with my own eyes. At the well, young wives leaned close, voices low but urgent. If she can speak against him, maybe we don't have to stay silent either. Not all were convinced. Some muttered that Eliza had cursed the town by bringing her trouble here. But the balance was tipping, subtle but steady.
Seeds of change had been planted, and like the prairie roses in Eliza's garden, they were stubborn things. That evening, the prairie sky burned orange as the sun dipped low. Nathaniel sat by the fire inside the cabin, the crackle of flames filling the space. Eliza settled across from him, her hands resting lightly in her lap. For a time, neither spoke.
The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was companionable, carrying the weight of things they both felt but had yet to name. At last she spoke. "When I said his name, Adam Walker, I thought my voice would fail me. I thought no one would believe me." Nathaniel looked into the fire. "They believed. You saw their faces." Her eyes glistened, though no tears fell. "I've been afraid for so long, afraid that the world was carved in his favor, that no truth could stand against him. But for the first time I wasn't afraid of silence, because I wasn't standing alone." The flames reflected in her gaze, and Nathaniel felt something shift inside him. He had buried his heart with Mary, or so he had believed. For years he had lived as if grief were all that remained. But tonight, across the fire, he felt warmth that was not from the flames alone. Still, he spoke carefully. "You have more strength than you know, stronger than me, perhaps." A faint smile touched her lips. "You carried me when I couldn't stand. That strength has a weight, too." For a while, they let the fire speak for them. Outside, the coyotes howled, the prairie stretched endless and indifferent, yet within the cabin there was a fragile sense of refuge. Nathaniel reached to the shelf, lifting the small wooden cross he had carved. He turned it in his hands, the edges rough beneath his calloused fingers. "Mary always said this house needed a woman's voice," he said quietly. "I thought I'd failed her by living in silence after she passed. But maybe the Lord wasn't done with me after all." Eliza's gaze softened. "And maybe he wasn't done with me either." The firelight flickered, catching the faint tremor of her smile. No vows were spoken, no promises declared, yet something deeper had taken root between them. It was not the reckless blaze of sudden love, but the steady glow of trust being born from shared scars. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain, a reminder that storms were never far in the prairie. But inside, for the first time in many years, Nathaniel felt the promise of spring. It was Eliza who first spoke of marriage, though not in the way Nathaniel expected. One evening, as they walked the fence line, the prairie stretching wide under a lavender sky, she paused beside the young oak tree Nathaniel had planted years ago. Her fingers traced the bark, rough but firm. "Storms bend it," she said, "but it holds, stronger every season." Nathaniel studied her, waiting. She lifted her eyes to meet his. "If I stand alone, Harrington will come again and again. If I stand beside you, before God and this town, he cannot so easily break me." The words were not a plea, but a declaration. Nathaniel felt them settle into his chest like an anchor. He had not thought of marriage since Mary's passing. Yet in Eliza's voice he heard not only the need for protection, but also the quiet strength of a covenant. That Sunday, word spread through Mill Creek. There would be a wedding at the Carter Ranch. Some scoffed, muttering that it was too soon, too bold. Others came with curiosity, some with reverence. By the afternoon, townsfolk gathered beneath the oak tree at the edge of Nathaniel's land, its branches arching like the roof of a cathedral. Reverend Clark stood ready, Bible in hand, his voice steady as he welcomed all. The women of the town hummed a hymn as they gathered, their voices weaving through the prairie air. "Be still, my soul, the Lord is on thy side." It was not sung in perfect harmony, but with the raw truth of people who had suffered loss, endured storms, and still believed. Eliza wore no finery, only a simple dress mended at the seams. Yet when she walked toward Nathaniel, her steps sure, the townsfolk fell silent. She carried herself not as a victim, but as a woman who had survived and chosen her path. Nathaniel stood waiting, his weathered hand steady, his eyes holding hers. Reverend Clark spoke of covenant, not romance alone. Marriage, he said, is not merely two hearts bound, but two souls joined under God's grace. so that where one is weak, the other may stand strong. Today, we witness not only the union of Nathaniel and Eliza, but the triumph of dignity over fear, truth over deceit. When it came time for vows, Nathaniel's voice was rough but unwavering. "I will stand beside you, Eliza. Before God, before this town, I will not turn away." Eliza's reply carried across the gathered crowd. "And I will stand with you, Nathaniel, not as property, not as shadow, but as partner in faith and in life." The minister blessed them, the crowd joining in a final hymn. Some sang through tears, others with tight jaws of determination. Even those who had doubted felt the weight of what they witnessed. This was no quiet rebellion. It was a declaration carved in faith and sealed in community. Afterward, as the people lingered, women approached Eliza with quiet words of gratitude. Men shook Nathaniel's hand with newfound respect. Harrington's shadow still hung over them, but it no longer seemed so long. As evening fell, Nathaniel and Eliza stood beneath the oak, the hymn's echo fading into the wind. The prairie stretched wide and uncertain before them, but they no longer faced it alone. Their covenant was more than marriage. It was a shield, a beacon, and perhaps a spark for others yet waiting to find their courage. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The days after the wedding passed with a fragile calm, but no one in Mill Creek believed Harrington had retreated for good. His pride was too deep, his influence too wide. And soon enough, word spread, like dry grass catching fire, that Judge Harrington had petitioned the county seat of Oak Ridge for a formal hearing. It was not simply spite, it was strategy. In his hands, the law was a weapon sharper than any blade. Harrington had friends in Oak Ridge, fellow judges who owed him favors, lawyers who fattened their purses in his court, and politicians who enjoyed his dinners. To them, this was not about a battered wife, but about order, property, and the preservation of a man's name. A notice was nailed to the post outside the Mill Creek Mercantile. Hearing regarding the condition and custody of Mrs. Eliza Harrington to be held in Oak Ridge Courthouse. The words struck like a hammer. Condition and custody, terms that stripped a woman of her humanity, reducing her to property and diagnosis. When Nathaniel read it aloud, Eliza's face paled. "So it begins again," she whispered. Nathaniel folded the paper with care, though his hands trembled. Guns could not defend against parchment sealed in wax. But he met her eyes and said quietly, "Then we face him there." The journey to Oak Ridge was a somber procession. A handful of townsfolk followed, not out of duty, but solidarity. Women who had stood in the church pews beside Eliza, men who had begun to doubt Harrington's shine of respectability. Their presence was a quiet defiance, a message that this trial would not go unseen. The Oak Ridge Courthouse loomed like a fortress, its white columns stained by years of dust storms. Inside, the benches filled quickly. Farmers, merchants, wives, and widows crowded the gallery, their faces lit by shafts of light from tall windows. The air was thick with anticipation, the hush of a community about to witness a reckoning. Harrington entered with calculated poise, dressed in dark wool, silver watch chain gleaming. His lawyer, a slick man with sharp features, carried a stack of papers bound with ribbon. They moved like men certain of their ground, buoyed by the weight of connections and law books. Nathaniel and Eliza took their place at the defense table. She sat straight-backed, though her knuckles whitened where she gripped her folded hands. Nathaniel glanced toward her, then toward Reverend Clark, seated quietly behind them. The minister bowed his head, lips moving in silent prayer. The judge's gavel struck wood, and the murmur ceased. The trial had begun. For Nathaniel, it felt like stepping into a storm where the horizon was swallowed in black.
Yet in Eliza's stillness beside him, he saw something steady, like a flame that refused to be snuffed out. The gavel had scarcely fallen when Harrington's lawyer rose, adjusting his waistcoat with deliberate calm. He moved with the confidence of a man who had rehearsed this performance a dozen times before, and knew his audience. "Your Honor," he began, voice smooth as molasses, "we are gathered today not to tarnish reputations, but to protect a vulnerable woman from her own delusions." He gestured gracefully toward Eliza, as though presenting a fragile specimen. "Mrs. Harrington has long suffered from a condition of the mind, hysteria, as any physician will attest. Her flights of fancy have turned into dangerous accusations, threatening not only her husband's honor, but the peace of this community." He paused, letting the words sink in. A few men in the gallery nodded. They had heard such language before. It was the tone of authority cloaked in benevolence, the language of control disguised as concern. Nathaniel clenched his fists under the table, but Eliza sat unmoving, her gaze fixed forward. The lawyer continued, weaving his net. "She claims violence where there was none. She invents conspiracies of murder in the dark, though the coroner ruled Mr. Adam Walker drowned. She has spoken in tongues of paranoia, imagining that even her neighbors whisper against her. Gentlemen of the court, we cannot allow such instability to govern itself. She requires care. She requires the steady hand of her rightful husband." The last words hung heavy, sharpened like a blade. Her rightful husband. In the gallery a stir rippled, not of agreement, but of unease. Women shifted on the benches, their faces shadowed. They knew this tune too well. It was the melody played whenever a wife dared raise her voice, whenever a daughter resisted. Some lowered their eyes, but others watched Eliza with quiet defiance, as though her courage lent them a measure of their own. The lawyer, sensing the shift, pressed harder. "We ask not for punishment, but for protection. Let Judge Harrington resume his duty as guardian. Let Oak Ridge be a beacon of order against the tide of chaos." When he sat, Harrington's smirk spread like oil on water. He leaned back, confident the ground had been won before the first stone was cast. Nathaniel glanced sideways. Eliza's lips pressed tight, her hands folded in her lap. But he saw the tremor in her shoulders, the effort it took not to flinch beneath the weight of those words. The gavel struck again. "The court will hear the defense," the presiding judge announced.
And so the true battle began, not of pistols and horses, but of memory, voice, and the fragile dignity of a woman who refused to be erased. The bailiff called her name, and all eyes turned as Eliza rose. She moved with quiet grace, but Nathaniel saw the strain in every step. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath her boots as she crossed to the witness stand. For a moment, as she placed her hand on the Bible, the room hushed. The lawyer wasted no time. He advanced with a smile too sharp to be kind. "Mrs. Harrington," he began, his tone dripping with mock courtesy, "do you deny that you have, in the past, suffered what women of delicate constitution often endure? Nervous fits, hysteria, moods beyond your control?" Eliza held her gaze steady. "I endured his fists, not fits." A ripple swept through the gallery, but the lawyer pressed on, voice louder. "And yet you claim your husband, respected judge, man of the law, struck you, when no neighbor has ever borne witness to such a scene?" "I was alone with him," she said softly. "That was his design." He circled like a wolf.
Alone? Convenient, is it not? No witnesses, no evidence, only your word against his.
And your word, madam, has been most imaginative. Murder conspiracies, whispered plots. Do you stand by these delusions even now? Her hands tightened on the rail. They are not delusions. Adam Walker died because my husband wanted his water rights. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but the lawyer only smirked. And where is this so-called proof? A body dragged by current? A coroner's ruling signed and sealed? Yet you dare accuse your husband of midnight murder? Mrs. Harrington, do you not see how wild you sound? Nathaniel's jaw ached from how hard he clenched it. He wanted to rise, to shout, but he knew this was her fight to speak. The lawyer leaned closer, lowering his voice for effect, though every ear strained to hear. Tell us, Mrs. Harrington, when you look in the mirror, do you truly believe you are sane? The words struck like a whip. A hush fell, cold and sharp. Eliza's breath caught, and for a moment Nathaniel feared the question had broken her. Then she lifted her chin. Her voice trembled, but it carried. When I look in the mirror, I see scars, not from madness, from survival. The gallery stirred again, women shifting, men exchanging uneasy glances.
The judge's gavel banged for silence, but the echo of her words lingered, etched into the room like scripture. For Harrington's camp, it was a dismissal, more proof of her instability. But for those listening with open eyes, the truth was shining through, even as it was twisted against her. Nathaniel had fought Comanches in the Llano, faced storms that stripped the roof from his ranch, but never had he felt so powerless as he did in that courtroom. He sat inches from Eliza, yet the gulf between them and the men in black coats above was wider than the prairie sky. He wanted to seize the lawyer by the collar, to shout down every lie. But what would that serve? A man who lost his temper in court lost his cause. So he gripped the edge of the table until the wood cut into his palms and fixed his eyes on Eliza. She sat straight, though her shoulders bore the weight of every sneer, every insinuation. Her answers were steady, but he could hear the tremor underneath. Nathaniel's chest burned with helpless rage, but beneath it ran something stronger, something that had carried him through darker nights: faith. He closed his eyes for the briefest moment.
Lord, make me strong enough to be her anchor. Behind them, Reverend Clark bowed his head. No words were spoken, yet Nathaniel could feel it. The hush of prayer, the quiet plea rising above the clamor of men who thought themselves gods. It was not a thunderbolt, no miracle to overturn the court, but a presence, steady, unseen, unyielding. When Nathaniel opened his eyes again, Eliza was looking at him. Just a glance, quick as a heartbeat. But in that glance he saw that she felt it too. She was not alone at the rail, not abandoned to the wolves. The lawyer scoffed, mistaking her composure for resignation. He launched another line of questions, his voice oily with false pity. Mrs. Harrington, surely you understand your husband only sought to protect you. His hand may have been stern, but was it not the hand of discipline? Eliza's lips parted, but for a moment no sound came. Nathaniel leaned forward slightly, not to speak, but to let her see him there, eyes locked on hers, a silent vow, "I believe you." She drew breath, and though her voice was quiet, it did not falter. Protection does not leave bruises. Discipline does not kill men for land. The gallery stirred again, the sound of shifting boots, muffled gasps, a cough to cover discomfort. The judge hammered the gavel, but order was no longer so easily maintained. Nathaniel's chest eased, just enough to breathe. He had not spoken a word, yet he had stood with her. Sometimes courage was not the shout that silenced lies, but the steady presence that reminded the weary they were not forsaken. At last the tables turned. Harrington himself was called to the stand. He rose with the ease of a man long accustomed to authority, brushing dust from his coat as though even the courtroom bowed to him. The gallery hushed. Here was the man who had judged them all, now forced to answer. His lawyer began gently, guiding him like a horse on familiar reins. Harrington spoke smoothly, each word polished, practiced. "I have served this territory faithfully for 20 years. I have upheld the law, kept peace where chaos would reign. My wife," he paused deliberately, his gaze sliding toward Eliza, "has been troubled in mind. I bore it patiently, with all a husband's duty. But her accusations are fabrications. I never raised a hand against her."
As for Adam Walker, the poor soul drowned, nothing more. Murmurs flickered through the gallery. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Harrington's tone was calm, but beneath it was the smugness of a man who believed truth could be bent like wire. Then came the cross-examination. The opposing counsel, a modest man from Oak Ridge, not in Harrington's pocket, stepped forward. His voice was sharp where the lawyer's had been smooth. "Judge Harrington, you claim you bore your wife's illness with patience, yet records show you consulted Dr. Everett only after Mrs. Harrington fled your home. If you were so concerned, why wait until she was gone?" A flicker crossed Harrington's face. He answered smoothly, but the pause had been seen. "And Adam Walker," the lawyer pressed, "you testified his death was a drowning. Yet a witness recalls you arguing with him the week before, over water rights. Did you not say, and I quote, 'I will see you buried before you steal from me'?" The gallery erupted in whispers. Harrington stiffened. His reply was sharp, too sharp. "Men quarrel. It proves nothing." It was then the crack widened. From the back of the room, a voice broke out, rough with years and guilt.
"It proves enough." All heads turned. A deputy, once Harrington's right hand, rose trembling. His hat clutched in both hands, his eyes downcast. "I was there that night. I followed him to the river. I saw him strike Adam Walker. I kept silent out of fear, but no more." The room exploded. Gasps, shouts, the judge hammering for order. Harrington surged to his feet, face purple, words lost in fury. But the damage was done. The veneer of control shattered. Nathaniel felt breath rush back into his lungs. This was not victory yet, but it was light breaking through storm clouds. The moment where truth refused to stay buried. The courtroom had erupted into chaos after the deputy's testimony. The judge's gavel pounded again and again, but order was slow to return. Harrington's face was a mask of rage, his lawyer whispering furiously at his side. The gallery buzzed like a hive disturbed, voices carrying shock, satisfaction, even fear. At last the presiding judge, a man sweating under the weight of the uproar, declared a recess. "This matter will require further review, more depositions," he stammered, his voice barely holding authority.
"The hearing is adjourned until proper procedure can be observed." It was a stall, plain to see. The law was not yet ready to topple one of its own. Appeals would be filed, documents exchanged. More weeks of delay spun out like threads from a spider's web. Harrington had bought himself time, but time was no longer his ally. As the gavel fell and the court began to empty, the shift in the room was unmistakable. Neighbors averted their eyes when Harrington passed. The handshake he extended to one merchant was left hanging in the air. Women who once crossed the street to avoid Eliza now moved toward her, some with tentative smiles, others with tears shining in their eyes. In the gallery, whispers carried louder than shouts. "Did you hear what the deputy said? We always suspected. The judge is not the man he claimed." Nathaniel helped Eliza rise from the stand. Her body was weary, shoulders sagging, but her head remained high. The tremor in her hands could not erase the steel in her eyes. She had endured every attack, every insult, and still she stood. Outside, the sunlight broke through ragged clouds. A small group gathered around them, women with children clutching their skirts, men with hats in hand. No speeches were made, no declarations shouted. Instead, there was a quiet nodding, a silent acknowledgement that the tide had turned. Harrington might drag the case through legal mazes, but in the court of the people, he was already condemned. Reverend Clark stepped forward, laying a hand gently on Eliza's shoulder. "The wheels of justice turn slowly," he said softly, "but truth has a way of outpacing them." Eliza closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the warmth of the sun. When she opened them, she looked at Nathaniel, and he saw not defeat, but a fierce, tempered strength. They had not won the war in ink and seal, not yet, but they had won something greater, the faith of their neighbors, the respect of the town, and the knowledge that Harrington's shadow was fading. And for the first time in many years, Eliza stepped forward into the street, not as a victim, but as a woman whose dignity had survived the fire. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. The road home was long, but for the first time in months, Eliza did not dread the miles ahead. She sat astride her mare, shoulders straight, the faint blush of evening painting the sky. Beside her, Nathaniel rode in silence, though not the silence of strangers. It was a companionable quiet, filled with unspoken gratitude that they were riding home together, not in chains of shame, not under the weight of fear. The prairie stretched wide around them, its grasses rippling under the spring wind. Here and there, wild roses had begun to bloom, pale pink blossoms clinging stubbornly to thorned stems. Nathaniel noticed how Eliza slowed her horse when they passed a patch of them, her eyes lingering on the petals. He said nothing, but the corner of his mouth softened into a smile. She had endured storms harsher than any this land had seen, and still, like those roses, she bloomed. When they entered Mill Creek, the town did not turn its back. People stepped from porches, pausing their chores. A few men tugged their hats. A cluster of children ran along the boardwalk, their laughter bright and unburdened. One little girl darted forward with a fistful of prairie flowers, holding them out to Eliza. For a heartbeat, Eliza froze. Then she leaned down, accepting the bouquet with hands that trembled not from fear, but from wonder. It was not a parade, no banners, no speeches, just nods, soft greetings, a hand raised in silent respect. Yet Nathaniel felt the shift. The town had seen what she endured, and though the law had stalled, the truth had rooted itself in the soil of their memory. Harrington could file petitions and shout in courtrooms, but the people had made their judgment already. Word traveled quickly in such places. By week's end, merchants were wary of trading with Harrington. His invitations went unanswered, his allies suddenly scarce. The house he had filled with authority now echoed with emptiness. Meanwhile, women began to move with a quiet boldness. Sarah Whitmore, the blacksmith's wife, insisted on keeping her dairy earnings rather than handing them over. A widow downriver refused to sell her land cheap to speculators. Small acts, but they carried weight. The tide was turning. For Eliza, each day back at the ranch was a reclaiming. She moved through the rooms without shrinking at every shadow. She worked the garden, her hands in the soil, planting herbs by the wooden cross Nathaniel had carved weeks before.
Neighbors came to visit, not all at once, but in twos and threes. Some brought bread, others brought nothing but themselves. They sat, drank coffee, and spoke of ordinary things: calves born early, fences that needed mending, hymns sung last Sunday. And in those conversations, Eliza was no longer whispered about, but spoken to, spoken with. One evening, Nathaniel found her at the garden fence, the last light of dusk clinging to her hair. She held the bouquet of prairie flowers a child had given her, now dried but still fragrant. "I never thought I'd stand here again," she said softly. "You're stronger than you think," he answered. She turned, her eyes steady. "No, I only had to remember what I already knew. That truth doesn't die just because someone powerful says it should." Nathaniel nodded, the words sinking deep. She was right. And the truth had begun to ripple beyond them, into kitchens, into barns, into the very soil of Mill Creek. The scars remained, yes, but they had not been in vain.
That night, as the prairie winds rustled the roses outside the window, Nathaniel felt the quiet certainty that the storm had passed. Not ended entirely, storms always returned, but passed, leaving behind a land softened with rain, ready for something new to grow. Sunday evening came with a hush. The prairie lay still, as though holding its breath. Nathaniel and Eliza rode into town together, their wagon carrying nothing more than a lantern and a loaf of bread for the gathering. The little whitewashed church stood at the edge of Mill Creek, its steeple plain but sturdy, the bell rope swaying in the breeze. Inside, the congregation was small: farmers, ranchers, wives with shawls, children rubbing sleep from their eyes. No grand choir, no polished pews. Just the sound of boots on wooden floorboards and the smell of oil lamps burning low. Yet there was a sacredness to the room that no cathedral could surpass. The minister gave no fiery sermon. He simply welcomed them, voice quiet and warm. "We are here to give thanks," he said, "for mercies we have seen, and mercies we still trust will come." Nathaniel and Eliza carried the lantern forward.
Together, they set it at the altar and lit the flame. The wick caught slowly, then steadied into a golden glow. The light spread, softening every face, chasing shadows from the corners. No applause followed, no great fanfare. Only silence, deep and reverent, as though all present understood what the lantern meant. For Eliza, it was more than fire in glass. It was a symbol of her survival, of God's hand that had carried her through when every earthly power had failed. For Nathaniel, it was the end of a long road of solitude. He was no longer the man who rode alone across the plains, with nothing but regrets. He had chosen to stay, to stand, to believe again. A hymn rose, unplanned. One voice began softly, then another joined, until the room swelled with a melody that trembled but did not break. Eliza sang, her voice low at first, then steady. Nathaniel did not sing, he only listened, the sound filling the hollow places in him he had thought would never heal. When the hymn ended, Reverend Clark spoke only one line: "Courts may falter, but God's justice does not." Heads nodded, not in triumph, but in recognition. It was truth they had always known, now spoken aloud.
The lantern burned on, small yet steadfast. Later, Nathaniel and Eliza stepped out into the night. The air was cool, fragrant with prairie grass. Above them, the sky stretched wide, stars freckling the darkness like grains of salt. The church bell tolled once, the sound carrying far over the fields, a reminder that even in the wilderness there was order, there was faith. They paused at the edge of the churchyard. Eliza slipped her hand into Nathaniel's. No words were needed. The weight of what they had endured, the cost of truth, the quiet strength of survival, it was all there in that single gesture. They were small figures against the vast sky, but not lost in it.
They were held by something greater, something that no trial could diminish and no power could overturn. As they walked homeward under the stars, the lantern's glow lingered behind them in the church window, a promise that the light would endure long after the night had passed. Step into the frontier, where love rises like lantern light against the endless prairie night. Our Western Love Stories series weaves tender hearts, silent courage, and timeless faith.
Ride with us. These are not just stories, but echoes of your own memories waiting to be rekindled.